welcome back to another video. So for today's sketchbook session, I wanted to do a little bit of redemption. So right off the bat, I do already have my sketches finished, and I wanted to kind of just reattempt to do another gouache painting, but of Selwyn, since I did end up doing gouache for the inside cover of this particular sketchbook, but I don't think I really like it all that much. So I thought it'd be fun to just repaint him again on just this random spread. Now, initially when I was doing these sketches, I was not too sure on what medium I wanted to actually color with or finish off this spread. So I just started off with sketching with the Uni Dia Colour lead, and this one I have in the color red. Now, typically if I'm doing any sort of sketching in my sketchbook or traditional art, I actually gravitate towards using the palette color Eno. I'm more comfortable using it, but I kind of had already an inkling that I wanted to do some sort of like wet medium, and I didn't want my sketch to immediately dissolve when it came in contact. So I'm not too sure if I've talked about the difference between the Uni Dia Colour red lead versus the palette color Eno red lead. So Uni Dia Colour comes in 0.5. I don't really remember if there is a 0.7 version. Maybe there is, but it's the only one that's compatible size-wise with my multi-pens like pencil compartment, because it only accepts 0.5. Otherwise, if it accepted 0.7, then I would use the palette color Eno type of lead throughout the rest of my multi-pen, because I do have like a red version, a blue, and a photo light blue for the Uni Dia Colour, and then I have like a bunch of different colors for the palette color Eno as well. But there are like differences between the leads. So like I mentioned, one of them is 0.5, which is like the Uni Dia Colour, and then the palette color Eno has 0.7. I find that the like Uni Dia Colour, at least for the color red, actually is a little bit more scratchier. So it's not my favorite in terms of just like normal sketching. It's not too bad, but it's like I do prefer a slightly more softer or creamier consistency in the lead. There's like another blue version, and I do have like the photo light blue version as well, but the blue version of the lead actually is like one of my favorite. I use it to sketch a lot because of how smooth and creamy it feels to sketch with. But then for the palette color Eno, all of them are pretty much like pretty soft. The lead does break, I think, a little bit easier in my opinion, maybe because it has like a softer core, but I like to use that because it is water soluble and it's not light fast. So that's kind of like one of the differences, or like one of the qualities I know that the palette color Eno has. And the reason why I often use it whenever I do painting, but it also requires me to do a pass of usually graphite, so I use a normal mechanical pencil on top typically, is that I sketch a little bit messier with the palette color Eno, knowing that the water will eventually dissolve my sketch and then it'll kind of low-key disappear. Not like super completely if I press too hard, but for the most part it can wash away all of my lines because it is water soluble. And then I often do a layer of graphite because I know that won't budge, so I can often use it to do much more cleaner lines, or I know I want lines to stay. So kind of like using the palette color Eno for a rough sketch and then a normal mechanical pencil on top to have a cleaner sketch. But this time around, because I kind of didn't want to do two passes of my sketch, I already did my sketch just with something that was not water soluble, or at least not as soluble as the palette color Eno. So I ended up using the Uni Dia, and I've noticed that the palette color Eno red lead is definitely much more of like a cooler red. It has more of like that pink undertone, while the Uni Dia Colour red lead has more of that orangey undertone to it, so it's a bit on the warmer side. So there is a bit of like a slight difference. I know it's gonna be hard to see on camera because it kind of appears a little bit more pink anyways. But let's kind of like move away from the tangent of talking about lead, red lead, whatever you want to call it. I'm just finishing up doing our quick wash of watercolor on top of our sketch of my OC Selwyn. So the kind of like sketch that I did end up doing for Selwyn is very similar to the ones that I did I think last week for Monday's video, where I ended up doing the ballpoint pen sketches with like the stars kind of like around his face or obstructing his face. So I kind of wanted to carry that theme over and do like a painted version. So I like using the watercolor kind of as like a base to let my paint adhere to, as well as just doing general planning for colors. If I want to plan out lighting or anything like that, then I can do it with the watercolors because I'm just more used to color mixing with watercolors and just the consistency. Then we're moving on to the gouache painting. So the majority of this video will just be in time lapse because oh boy, does it take me a long time just in general to paint with gouache, because I'm always a little bit hesitant in terms of how I handle gouache, I feel like. So how long has it been? It might have been like 2 weeks, 3 weeks since the Danhong painting video. And I've already completely forgot how I approached that painting. I should have just rewatched my footage, but every time kind of like I start a new gouache painting, it feels like I'm starting over from scratch. Like I don't know how to approach it, other than the fact that I like to paint the skin first, then the eyes, then the hair, and then the rest of the body or hands or clothing or whatever have you that's left over. That's all I remember. Everything else is like, do I like painting darks first? Do I like doing midtones? Do I like trying to blend the colors immediately? All that stuff I just kind of like throw out of the window. So while I was painting Selwyn, I feel like his didn't turn out too poorly for the most part. It was his hair and like his eye color, everything else was pretty straightforward. I think it's just every time when I start to paint something, let's say like the hair, I always have like a mental battle between cel shaded or going to have a lot of blending and making things look very soft, because that's typically my preference, but I know it's not in my wheelhouse when it comes to painting with gouache, because painting with any sort of like more opaque medium is just for some reason doesn't click in my brain as easily. I mentioned this like in a bunch of different videos that watercolor is more up my alley in terms of painting, and I find it interesting. I think one of you guys pointed out that you're kind of like the complete opposite, and like watercolor is low-key a nightmare and you prefer mediums like gouache and acrylic. I know for me it just doesn't work for me at all. I do like slowly layering up and like gradually like darkening things, adding colors, being able to make things look very soft and blend very easily, just having like a very clean wet brush. But then using something like gouache and like having the color mixing, sometimes it boggles my mind, maybe because the medium's more opaque, maybe it's because I don't like working from like mid-tone and then having your shadows and your highlights to kind of like needing to bring those out at like any stage, and maybe that's leaving me with too much room for error. While like I feel like I always have like at least some sort of method when working with watercolors, because typically you work from light to dark no matter what, unless you have the opportunity to preserve some areas and go dark right away and do a lot of lifting, or use like an opaque medium afterwards. That's always an option. But for me, it just clicks better to work from light to dark and then gradually have the ability to work with transparent layers or work in a very soft method. So I'm mostly talking about this because I ended up doing 2 gouache sessions, almost like back to back. I ended up doing Selwyn on one day, or like one evening, and then the next morning I ended up doing another painting session, which is actually directly behind this painting of Selwyn. And while I was painting the character, I was struggling very, very hard once again with the hair. Selwyn's was not too bad. Like I said, it's a little bit more straightforward, but I did have a little bit of that back and forth of like, do I want it softer near like his face? Do I want the highlights to be like very bright and prominent, or do I want to establish the highlights like during the time when I was establishing his base of his hair color, and kind of going back and forth with that. But the other character that I ended up painting, I repainted probably over and over and like layering things up so many times because I was very indecisive. I think I started off with too light of a base that was more towards like his skin tone, and then I started to build it up a little bit more, and then immediately covering it with what I thought was more like closer to the base color of his hair, and then immediately going darker and then lighter and darker and lighter and keeping going back and forth. So I was very like, I don't know, it was at the point where you think, oh, I should just stop and maybe I can salvage it with maybe a medium that I'm more comfortable with. But sometimes I have to realize that it does have to go through like that ugly phase, and that always baffles me sometimes when it comes to at least doing stuff with an opaque medium, because I kind of just lose my sketch. And I know it's kind of like the approach that I take whenever I paint with something like gouache. I'm sure like people who are more proficient in it are able to block out the shapes and like you don't really lose your figure or whatever you're drawings, like their form and stuff doesn't really disappear. I always block things in as like one giant chunk and then slowly build up our shadows or adding a little bit more saturation or whatever. So similar to like how I did the face, I would paint over everywhere that had more of like the base skin tone and then gradually add in our shadows where the hair and the skin meet. I'll add a little bit more warmth around the eyes and like slowly build it up. But if I stop way too early, I definitely am gonna lose my sketch and just like don't know where the placement of anything is, which sometimes does skew my painting a little bit more or drastically change what the painting looks like. And I think it happens with the second session that I ended up doing, which will not be in today's video because this one's already long enough with painting Selwyn. But the one thing that I'm at least happy for or grateful for is the fact that I haven't hit exactly that wall with gouache like I do typically in other sessions where I'll paint with gouache after taking like a very long hiatus and not using it and then coming back to it, immediately hating it, and then going back to just never using the medium for let's say like a few months to like half a year or so. So after at least doing the Danheng painting that I did with gouache a few spreads ago, I still had at least some want or need to do gouache again in the sketchbook, hence why I'm painting Selwyn right now. And then I was still transferring some of that energy and motivation onto the next painting, which might have killed it for me. Who knows? I might still try to persevere. It also depends on like my fixations probably as well, how dedicated I want to stay painting whoever I'm painting. So at least for this one of Selwyn, I did have a goal to at least like it more than the one that I did for the inside cover of the sketchbook, because I wish that I had the confidence to just paint over that one and try to fix it up in the ways that I think would at least correct the reasons why I don't like it. But because I'm so iffy about gouache, I don't think I want to touch the front page. Maybe I'll just try to remember how much I didn't like it and try to keep that up for the next time I actually have to work on the inside cover again, which probably will just be the end of the sketchbook, because I do like to match the front and the back at least together so we can have a little bit more of like a direct redemption for that piece. I'm also kind of like playing around with the idea of maybe doing a gouache spread as well for the halfway point of the sketchbook. I think we're about a quarter of the way through or just past a quarter. I am working in the sketchbook a tiny bit faster than usual just because I have been spending a little bit more time allowing myself to do at least like planning for other illustrations in the sketchbook before I commit to them. Because I did one I think for Danheng, I did it for Chongyun, and I did it for Durin for when I did the Halloween illustration. And I did like 2 spreads probably for Danheng, 2 spreads for Durin, and just like half a spread for Chongyun just to plan out like poses or like general notes if I want to have specific color schemes, whatever. And then yeah, I think because of that I've been using my sketchbook at least a little bit more, but I think it's kind of fun having those more bare bones sketches and then occasionally having these ones that are kind of full color, at least on half of the spread right here, because I don't think I have the energy, and I know I didn't have the energy to do any more painting for the left hand side of the spread, because I think a part of me had the hope that if I enjoyed the painting session so much of this larger Selwyn, that I would eventually paint the smaller ones on the left hand side. But I can tell you, I think the session probably was about 3-ish hours. I think usually my gouache pieces or like painting pieces typically are around that kind of time frame if I'm working around the similar size. Even like when I do marker illustrations, sometimes it's only like an hour and a half or like to 2 hours. But with gouache, because I do a lot of back and forth, sometimes I'm watching videos or like maybe I'm getting distracted, or I'm just like taking a lot of time to like deliberate between like, oh, do I want to work on this? Do I cover up this? And like letting it dry and then working on a different part, that it does take me a little bit more time. And at least for these types of painting videos, I do try to break it up so that I don't get too tired of the one piece of like the illustration that I'm working on. But there's no way that I was actually going to tackle 3 in one day. And it kind of sucks because I think I am... How to explain this? So in the past, when I first got myself using this particular HIMI jelly gouache, this is like years ago when I was painting, I think it was Jonghan from 17 and Wonu from 17. I have like 2 spreads in my sketchbook that I actually really liked that I did of them, and those ones were kind of like around the same size as the little Selwyns on the left hand side, so they're kind of like smaller headshots. But I think I did more of like a full painted spread with like multiple people painted, but at this point I feel like I can only really paint one slightly larger headshot on like one side of the page for the most part. Part of it is because like my brush control is not too great when working with gouache. I don't know if it's because I still struggle a little bit with finding that good consistency so that lines or certain colors are still opaque enough, but I want to have like thinner or smaller areas to paint with. So I might play around to see if there's any other brushes that I might want to use, because I'm still a little bit on the lazy side when it comes to painting, and if I have brushes that worked for the most part, I don't usually switch too often. Granted, with gouache at least, I switch between 3, so I kind of use I think it's like a flat brush, and then I have 2 kind of like round brushes. This one, let's say it's like a size, I don't even know, size 4, and maybe the other one's around size 6 or 7, so it's like a little bit bigger than this one. So I kind of use those to just generally paint the entire piece. But then with watercolor, if I can get away with it, I will just use the one brush, which is like a size 5 is typically my favorite. Or a size 6. Around a 6 round is typically my favorite for watercolor brushes. So if I can get away with it and just paint with that, then I will, because I don't want to think about like, oh, I have to find the appropriate brush and then making sure that my palette or like the pans that I'm using are more appropriately sized and I'm not accidentally like spilling the colors anywhere or accidentally putting too much pigment versus like water and all that stuff. I'm just like rambling about my preferences at this point. So for this piece of Selwyn, I ended up going with kind of like a teal minty-ish color for the background. I was not too sure if I wanted to go darker and then have the stars really pop out, but instead I kind of went the opposite direction. So the background's more of like a pastel color, and then I wanted the stars to be a little bit more on the darker side so that they can kind of pop out from the background. Otherwise, if I remember my ballpoint pen sketches, I made the background a little bit more darker, and as you go forward, the stars would be more prominent and much more lighter. And I do still like that look. I did attempt by adding a little bit more of like a grayish blue into the stars to kind of push some of them back. I had orange kind of as like the bridging midtone in between the stars, but I don't know. I don't think this turned out exactly the way I wanted, and I'm very, 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 very tempted to do a watercolor version because I am pretty sure that I can execute it in watercolor better than I can do it with gouache. So maybe for a future video, or maybe I'll do it for a stream, because I want to get back into streaming and I've been really enjoying doing traditional art streams more recently. So maybe I'll plan something like that for a future stream instead. So last but not least, or at least I think this is like the second last thing I'm gonna do for this spread, is that I decided to mix up kind of like the similar-ish color. It's a little bit more of like a sky blue rather than like the slightly more greenish tinge to the minty-ish green color that I ended up using for the back of the larger Selwyn. And I just wanted to add a little bit of border of color to match kind of our smaller sketches because it was looking a little too sparse, and it kind of helps connect the entire spread together. And then one last thing I wanted to do for at least painting with gouache is the fact that I wanted to add the little stars around it. So I added a little bit of like a very soft pastel yellow, and then I went back in with kind of like black or very dark muted blue to add some darker stars. Oh, I think I forgot to mention this at the beginning of the video because I jumped right into talking about red lead, is the fact that I ended up using blue painter's tape to tape off a border. And I did this in the past whenever I painted with gouache because I like the kind of clean, crisp edge, but also it leaves an area for my binder clips to keep my paper down while I'm painting, and without like kind of like leaving a random rectangle on the page and having to paint it later. So it just kind of gives it a little bit of cleaner look. but I wanted a few stars to break the border, so I didn't want to retake out my gouache again because I've already put it away at this point, and I just used a black gel pen to quickly fill in the rest. And I think that is all for today's little session. Now, the second session that I mentioned that I did after I painted this one of Selwyn is actually just probably going to be a video as a backup because of the project that I wanted to do might take longer, so it might be for next week. If not, you might just see it in the future at some point. Hint, I did paint Flint once again, but I did it with gouache, and I have very mixed feelings about that painting, but I think that's okay. That's gonna be for a different day. Who knows, in the near future or not. Ow. I don't know if it's evident. Usually when I talk doing the voiceovers, I do move my arms and hands a lot, so yeah. But yeah, I think that is the end of today's little session, and hopefully you guys enjoyed watching me paint with gouache, and I'll talk to you guys next time in the next video. Bye bye!